Hey guys, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk all the time about the Beatles. The group years, the solo years, any topics that come to mind, sometimes what's in the news. You never can tell from one show to the next what we're going to cover. And right now we have a special guest on with us. He's the author of this brand new book called The Beatles on the Charts. It's MICHAEL Ventrella. And this book has just come out. And if you follow the work that I've done, with my podcast shows and my radio show, every little thing, you will know that I am a champion of the charts, the Billboard charts. I quote them all the time, where the singles have gone, where the albums have gone. If you're into that kind of thing, this book is right up your alley because it covers where songs and albums peaked, how many weeks it spent on the charts, and also where it ranks overall in the entire history of the charts, with the Billboard chart specifically. So, Michael, welcome to Ken Michaels Radio.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
My first question, well, first of all, at the very beginning of the book, you talk about your history and your love of the charts. Tell the folks a little bit about that, because in a way it's kind of similar to what I went through.
Oh yeah, when I was young, I wanted to be a musician and be in a band. I actually did end up in quite a few different bands, none of which made it. But I always thought, oh, I'd love to see my songs on the charts. And I would get up every Sunday morning and listen to Casey Kasem's Top 40 and keep track of it. And every week I'd hope that the songs I liked got higher, and I'd get upset when the songs I didn't like made number one. So I kept track of all that kind of stuff. And at the end of every year, Casey Kasem would do a countdown where they take all the songs, and if a song got to number one, they'd give it 100 points, and if it got to number 100, they give it 1 point, and they'd add all the points up. So the longer it stayed on the charts and the higher it got, the better it did on the chart. And I always thought that was fun to listen to the year-end countdown to see, how well my songs, the songs I liked, did on the year-end countdown. So I've always been a follower of the charts. And then in the 80s, I kept track of it even when I was going to college for the Beatles, because I wanted to see how the Beatles were doing.
Right.
And I wrote an article for Good Day Sunshine, the Beatles fanzine back in the 80s, where I actually did that. I took the songs and I took the albums and I counted them down just like I did in this book. And so it's been something I've loved to do for a long time. And this book was just the idea of, there are so many Beatles books, and I always wanted to write about the Beatles, but I thought, what can I write that no one else has done? And then I thought, I can't be the only person who likes reading about the charts. And I
Right.
was, yeah, so I put the book together.
Well, we have a lot of similarities there, because I used to listen to American Top 40 with Casey Kasem religiously every single week, write down the top 40 singles, try to figure out as it's counting down where my favorite songs remained or where it would fall, root for my favorite songs, root for the songs I didn't care for. I mean, not root for them.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and yeah, the year-end shows were fun. It was great 1976 when Silly Love Songs was the #1 song of the year.
Exactly.
Um, and yeah, also I used to write for Good Day Sunshine as well. And the woman who became my wife, then Joanne DeSera, was a contributing writer.
Okay.
So, we have a lot in common there.
Excellent.
Not only that, but the very first Beatle book I ever bought was All Together Now,
And
which
that,
is
yeah,
and that kind of also part of that book was showing week by week where the singles were on the Billboard charts,
and I
also the Melody Maker charts. And so you actually copied doing the same thing.
I did, and I actually mentioned Walter Podzak, and in the book, and I mentioned that he was an inspiration, and that book was definitely an inspiration. It was wonderful to meet him at the Beatles Fest a couple years ago, and he actually wrote a really nice blurb for this book too. He liked it as well. So it's all come full circle. Yes, I'm sort of finishing what he started.
Yeah, and for those of you not familiar with All Together Now, it covered all the Beatles and solo music up through the end of 1975. So all the charts, all that you saw towards the end of the book, week by week, would be the Billboard charts up to the end of 1975, but simultaneously singles and albums and where they were placed. But you covered this all through the end of 2021.
Yes. Yeah,
So
so that took a lot of work going through every single Billboard magazine from then to now just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And sometimes it was very weird, especially now, the way they counted. Things would zoom up the chart and then zoom right back down again. Like Magical Mystery Tour one time appeared and then disappeared the very next week, and I have no idea why. But without checking the charts every single week, I would not have known that.
That's one of the things that I really need this book for, because there are a lot of albums, especially in recent years, that would be on the charts for 1 week or just a couple of weeks. And unless you actually looked online or had a copy of Billboard magazine, you wouldn't know that.
Right.
So yeah. Why Billboard?
Because that's the only one that's still around that I could follow all the way from the beginning to the end, and it would have been nice to see if I had tried to do Billboard and Melody Maker, whatever it's called. Suddenly I'm blanking out on the name, and Cashbox. If I tried to do
Right.
all together, it just would have been too much of a book, I think, and it would have been hard to say which one we should use. And this way was consistent. It's one magazine all the way through from beginning to end.
Yeah, sometimes people ask me that question. What is the big deal about Billboard magazine? Because we did have Cashbox, we had Record World,
Yes,
you
there you go.
know,
That's what I was thinking.
and there's even a syndicated radio show that plays oldies that goes by the Cashbox results. So what is it about Billboard all these years? Were they considered more authoritative than all the others? Do you know?
I don't think so. I think it's just that it's business. They were able to keep in business and grab the market when the other ones didn't. Sometimes just because some business lives and the other one dies out doesn't mean it's a better business. It just means that they have better business sense. I
Yeah.
mean, I always thought that what was it, VHS and Betamax? Betamax was a better version, but it didn't last long. VHS lasted just because they were better promoted. I have no idea why.
Right. And when some people say to me, a certain song, Beatles or Solo, went to number one in Cashbox, but it only went to number two in Billboard, some fans would rather go to Cashbox and accept a higher result. So
I agree. I know, but I'm trying to be consistent here.
I know it's just I was brought up on Casey Kasem. So for me, Billboard has been the way to go. And I've always, and I subscribed to it for a while when I could afford it because it's really expensive.
Oh yeah, well I was the program director for my college radio station for quite a few years, and I got a free copy every week, with the school paid for it, and I loved that. And then after that, when I went to law school, I just would go to the library because they'd had it at the library, and I'd read it there. Now you can get it online, of course.
Hmm. I wanted to start by mentioning this little tidbit of trivia, and this is really impressive that you include early in your book. That from January 18th, 1964 through December 15th, 1979, there was always a Beatles song or album or solo on the charts. That's
You
extraordinary.
Nobody else can beat that record. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? To think about it. There was always something there. So every week, even if all you did was watch the Beatles charts for the albums, there was always something you could find that you could be happy about.
Hmm. I also think this book is essential because there are a lot of new Beatle fans, thankfully, that aren't aware of just how successful the solo careers were.
Mhm.
And there's no greater affirmation of that than the charts, because the charts reflect when the music is being exposed in those days on the radio, how the public responded to it. Nobody was forced to buy these records, but they went out and bought them.
Mhm.
So when you see a song like It Don't Come Easy went to number 4 on the charts, the public liked it.
Yeah.
While McCartney, post Beatles, had 9 number 1 singles, in addition to the 20 number ones
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
group, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to. The problem now is, of course, young people treat the Beatles like oldies, so they don't really realize or maybe they don't realize how popular they were. But this is a good way to figure that out. Obviously, you look at the chart and say, look, they were number one, they were everywhere. Um, I don't know. It's hard to imagine people who don't understand how popular they were.
Hmm.
You're just denying facts if that's the case.
Now, one thing that gets really confusing for me, and actually I wrote to you about this a few weeks ago, because
Yeah.
people do ask about this a lot. Um, the Beatles had a lot of double-sided hits as singles. And when they started out, both sides of the same single charted separately. Okay? They weren't the first ones to do this. Elvis Presley had a lot of hits just like that.
Yep.
And then once Come Together and Something was released, and initially they charted separately, they abandoned that. And all of a sudden it became Come Together / Something, and it was a number 1 hit.
Yeah. Billboard was kind of weird. You know, they used to care more about airplay than they did about sales. So that's why the B-side would get on. And even then, that didn't make a lot of sense because there were songs off of Sgt. Pepper's album that were being played on top 40 radio all the time, but they never made the chart because they weren't on a piece of vinyl. So
Right.
they weren't even internally consistent, I guess I should say. But then around 1970, they decided they're going to start only counting, they're going to count more towards sales than radio play. And for some reason, they decided they were not going to count two sides separately. I think they just saw come together and something kept passing each other. Like one day, something would be at the top and then come together would be at the top, and they'd both pushing to number one. Whereas if you combine them together, they would have been number one for weeks, you know, theoretically, because they were, you added the two of them together, it should have been really high. So they finally put them together and they became number one, as you might guess. And for a while, they were listing the B-sides like that quite a bit. My Sweet Lord / Isn't It a Pity was listed on the charts. Another Day / Oh Woman Oh Why, even though, you know, Oh Woman Oh Why really didn't get a lot of airplay, it got some. And they were starting to do that. And then after a while, they stopped doing that too. So now they only count the A side. Well, I shouldn't say now. Now things are really different. But for a while, they were only counting the A sides. But it was confusing. And that's one of the problems with the book is trying to compare the charts, which we could talk about because the way they do the charts is completely different. It's changed over the years.
Which only keeps things more confusing.
Absolutely.
When you're trying to get final results of everything. But as always, I've always heard 20 number one hits by the Beatles or 20 number one songs. If come together in something, both hit number one. Don't they really have 21?
That's a good argument. And I would kind of agree with you because I think if they hadn't combined them then, or if they'd waited like another 6 months and started it at the beginning of 71, you probably would have had Come Together hit number one, followed by something hitting number one, and maybe going even back and forth. So chances are they both would have hit number one eventually.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't know. Like I said, the problem is how they kept the charts, and there's no consistent thing. And one thing I point out in the book is that this is not a science. You know, the fact that a song is number one doesn't necessarily mean that it sold more than the song that's at number 15. It just means that compared to other songs at the time on the radio, this one was doing better, you know? So no one should look at this book like it's a scientific fact. How's that?
Well, to me, I've always looked at it as a combination of airplay and sales. So theoretically, a number one single should be one that when you combine the two is higher than all the other songs beneath it. So how do you differentiate between a double-sided single like We Can Work It Out, hit number one, Day Tripper, the other side, hit number 5 in America? They both sold the same amount of copies.
Yeah.
So it all comes down to airplay.
Yeah, and it's so weird. That's why I'm saying, you know, this is fun to read, but you can't take it too seriously. You know, I listed both of them separately in the book because they were listed separately on the Billboard chart, even though technically you're right, it was the same single. But back in those days, they counted airplay a little bit more than they counted sales, although sales were counted, obviously. But it wasn't as much sales as it was both sides. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the other magazines did the same thing. You know, they listed both sides.
Okay. Well, let me tell you some of the problems I have with the way everything is tabulated. As you explained it before, and you can repeat this again. The way I understand it is with the singles, with the Hot 100, if a song peaked at number 100, it got 1 point. If it peaked at number 99, it got 2 points. Every single week it's on the charts, it gets more points based on where it's positioned. If it gets to number one, it not only gets 100 points for being number one, it gets an additional 100 points above that, right?
No, that's how Billboard does it. I didn't do that.
Okay.
Billboard would give it a bonus. And to me, that didn't quite seem fair because to me, you know, if a song hits number one, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100 times better than the song at number two, which is what their point thing did. And that didn't seem fair to me because a song could peak at number two and still be tremendously popular. So I did not do that. Billboard would do that at the end of their year.
Okay.
So I did not do that.
All right. But it just seemed to me that, at least based on how everything was tabulated in your book, there was far more of an emphasis on longevity than where it peaked.
Yes.
And that's where I have a tremendous problem because, like, one example that really troubled me here, the song that you listed, no, that there could be several, but the number 51 song of all time, Beatles and solo, is Yesterday.
I know.
Number one for 1 week. No, number one for 4 weeks. I'm sorry. It's on the charts for 11 weeks. And then the song that's ranked number 50, ironically, is Another Day, yesterday, and then Another Day. But Another Day only went as high as number 5, but spent 12 weeks on the chart. So how could that rank higher than yesterday?
I know, isn't that weird? But basically, if you look at you can do the math yourself. All the charts are in the back of the book, so you can always
Uh-huh.
figure it out yourself. But generally speaking, yesterday zoomed up the charts and then zoomed way back down again. I mean, it didn't like slowly go down, whereas Another Day sort of slowly left, and so it dropped much. It was much higher when it dropped, and it's just the way the math works. You know, I can't really explain it, but it's just weird. I know, and the problem is, of course, you have to compare the times too, because I am absolutely positive yesterday sold more records than Another Day. You know,
Sure.
there's no question about that. But the way the charts are done, it was very weird. Back in those days when they counted more about airplay, a song would zoom up and zoom back down as DJs got tired of playing it, even though people might still be buying it. Whereas when they started counting sales more in the 70s and 80s, songs would stay on much, much longer. And so that's why it's very difficult to compare them. And even I will admit this, because a lot of the great Beatle hits are not in the top 10 or top 20. They're like way down, like you said, number 50 or
Right.
so, which doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't think they would be there, but that's just the way the chart worked out, because of the way the charts were kept. And then now, of course, they're doing everything completely different. Now they're counting YouTube videos and streaming and everything else. So it's almost back to the old days of radio play, even though it's not really radio anymore, than it is sales. And so a song will stay on for a very long time when people are still watching it. And that's why like 4 or 5 seconds gets rated so high, even though it
Mm-hmm.
didn't sell that well and didn't get that high on the charts. It just stayed around forever. And, it's also why Twist and Shout is so high on our charts, because it fell off the charts and came back again. And so it
Right.
has longevity that pushes it way up higher, even though I doubt if it sold more copies than whatever was below it.
Well, 4 or 5 seconds still went top 10.
Yeah,
And worldwide was a massive hit,
yes,
you
true.
know. So you know, top 10 is not shabby.
No, no, definitely not. No. But I'm saying
um
if you look, it was on the charts for a very, very long time. And I think that made all the difference for 4 or 5 seconds, for instance.
so you bring up a great point here, and I question why those singles in the 60s stayed on the charts so just for sometimes 10 weeks
Yeah.
and less. Can't Buy Me Love was number one for 5 weeks, half of its chart life. It was only on the charts for 10 weeks. You can't tell me that this is because of DJs not wanting to play because they're tired of it, because I can't believe that after only 10 weeks, the public was tired of Can't Buy Me Love.
But you also notice that they would put out a single every 2 or 3 months back then. So something
Right.
would go back down, and by the time it's starting to go down, there's another one to take its place. And so that one now grabs all the attention, and this one falls down. I think that has something to do with it too. I mean, they put out an album every 6 months. No one does that anymore, you know? And these were great albums. It's just amazing that they could do that every 6 months. And then there was a single every 2 or 3 months. So sometimes it was just like, there was something new to grab your attention. So the old one fell off. And that's not just for the Beatles. I mean, other bands were doing the same thing,
Hmm.
at the time. I remember I interviewed Tommy James one time, and he had an album every 3 months. They had a new album out. They were just
Right.
pounding the stuff out. So, as soon as one got popular, they put the other one out. And then I think that has something to do with it too.
It
Just the way
still
things were done back then.
it still baffles me. I still
Yeah.
don't know why. I can pick any Beatles single here, but if I'm bringing up "Can't Buy Me Love," why wouldn't it stay in the bottom half of the Hot 100 for another 3 months?
I
I
don't
don't
know.
understand why it would just die like that.
I can't answer that question. You need to find someone from Billboard and strap them to a table and interview them.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I know from having listened to American Top 40 and the year-end countdowns, there'd be singles that ranked very highly because they were on the charts for a long time.
Mhm.
It took a long time to peak,
Yes.
you know.
I,
Um,
I remember one, Paul Davis had a song.
I go
Yeah,
crazy.
right. Remember that? It like
Yeah,
it took like 45 weeks to get to the top 10. I'm like, oh
yeah.
my. Yeah, yep. I remember that when I was keeping track of them, going, oh my God, it's still there. What's going on?
Yeah. So my argument is that whether it's your book or even Billboard, there has to be a different way to compute these results.
I
And
wish I knew a way. I'm not a mathematician, and I wish I could find a way to compare them and sort of figure out a way to do some sort of math that takes into account all those different things. But I need someone smarter than I am when it comes to math and try to figure out some sort of formula to do that.
Yeah. See, the way I look at this, and I don't know if you want to reveal what the number one song is, that's up to you, but a song like Hey Jude, number one for 9 weeks,
Yes.
more than any other Beatles or solo Beatles single. That should be, no questions asked, the number one song.
It should have been. If it had stayed on the chart just slightly longer, it probably would have been. And that's one of the reasons in the back of the book, I do an alternate countdown,
Right.
where I do count it down based on how high it got. So if you look at that chart, it is absolutely number one, because it stayed on the charts for the longest. So if you go by what's the highest position, absolutely that is number one. And that's why I did the alternate countdown too, because I agree with you. It's kind of didn't make sense that Hey Jude was not number one. It really should have been.
That's just how my brain works. Since I know where these songs peaked, Hey Jude was number one 9 weeks. I Want to Hold Your Hand 7 weeks.
Yeah.
Ebony and Ivory 7 weeks. That should be like the top three right there. It's to look at it any other way. I understand why it's being done, and I think longevity matters, but I think when you're number one for that long, that's a statement to itself. So
well, that's probably why Billboard gives the extra 100 points, because it stays at number one, and they wanted to give an extra bonus. I just didn't feel right doing that, because I felt sorry for number twos. For all the number two song only sold one copy less than the number one song. So why should this one get 100 extra points? That's sort of how I was looking at it.
Right. And I feel sorry for the singles that peaked at number two, and there would be several singles that would climb above it. It wouldn't be like one song dominated the whole time.
Oh, like
Live and Let Die.
Right. It was at number two for like 3 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. And every time another song skipped over it. So it never made it to number one. See, that's why I thought that's not really fair. If these other songs should get 100 points and it doesn't.
All those years ago was the case of Betty Davis Eyes. Now that was the dominating single, and George couldn't make it past number two because of that one song.
Yeah.
But question here. You've got EPs that are on both charts.
I know.
Why?
Because that's what Billboard did. Billboard used to release the EPs on the singles charts back in the 60s. And then a couple of years ago, they re-released it for Record Day. When they re-released one of the old EPs as a record, and for some reason Billboard listed it on the album chart instead of on the single chart. Don't ask me why, but that's why it's on my album chart, because that's what Billboard counted it as. That's a question that I cannot answer.
I want to get your take on this other thing, and it's only in the last few years that I've realized this. I'm very happy the end of every year when Happy Christmas and Wonderful Christmas Time re-enters the charts. If you're lucky, it makes the top 40, but when they first came out, they weren't on the charts at all, and they only had a Christmas chart, right?
Correct. And that was kind of ridiculous, because they would only they'd have a separate chart for Christmas songs, so it would never make the top 40 chart. And it really should have, because I know that people were buying, Wonderful Christmas Time. And I know that the radio stations were certainly playing Happy Christmas.
Yeah.
And, even Ding Dong Ding Dong made the chart. But the idea that they kept it separate hurt it on our charts, because they didn't until like a few years ago start counting it on the regular charts. And as I point out in the book, now every Christmas, if you get up a Billboard around Christmas time, Mariah Carey's jumping up there, and Bing Crosby shows back up every Christmas, and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So they're now counting everything. And so these songs are now reappearing on the charts. So it's kind of weird when you look at Happy Christmas and you say, what was the first chart appearance? 2012? What the hell? You wouldn't think that.
So on the one hand, I'm thrilled to see all these people, Gene Autry and Andy Williams and Bing Crosby, and they're in the top 10 or they're in the top 40 because these are great songs, but they didn't make the charts when they first came out. Brenda Lee. I mean, it's baffling.
It's frustrating. I mean, on one hand, I think it's much better now that they do that. I wish they had done that back then, but we can't go back in time and change things.
But at the same time, you could have Mariah Carey hitting number one 10 times with the same song.
Right, but Kate Bush had a number one hit just a while ago. That was a 30 or 40-year-old song because it was
Right.
played on television. And suddenly everyone downloaded. Next thing you know, Running Up That Hill is number one. It's like, okay, but if that's what people are buying, why shouldn't it be on the chart? And it wasn't released as a single. That's the weird thing. Nowadays, because it's all based on downloads, someone comes out with a new album, and the next thing you know, all 10 of the songs on the album are in the top 10 or in the top 40 or whatever it is. And that's completely different the way it was. In other words, I don't know. I'm trying to think of somebody who's really, really popular now, Taylor Swift. I don't know, comes out with a new album, and suddenly every single song on the album is in the top 40 because everyone's downloading it. So they're doing it completely different these days. You really can't compare them.
Yeah, I mean, Justin Bieber went through that.
Right. And the problem is they're all bragging, look, we've had more hits on the charts than the Beatles. Well, no, it's completely different. If you had done that back in those days, the Beatles would have easily beat those people because every Beatles song was being played on the radio in 1964, if it was on an album or a single or whatever.
And they didn't have to make physical copies of every song.
Yeah.
The new artists of today.
That's true. So it's much easier to just download everything. And on the other hand, I think it's more accurate. If that's what people are buying and listening to, then that's what the chart should say.
It's more accurate, but I do believe that if Happy Christmas and Wonderful Christmas Time charted when it first came out, you would probably have top 10 singles from the two of them.
Yeah, I agree.
And it may never actually get to the top 10.
Yeah,
but I'm happy that it's anywhere. But to me, that's just not accurate.
No, and that's I will admit that is one of the shortfallings of this book, because I can't make it any more accurate than it is because Billboard was not more accurate. I'm stuck with the data I have.
Right, but still, that's what makes your book valuable. If you care about the way it has appeared in Billboard, go with your book.
Yeah.
And this is another thing. Oh man, this drives me crazy. When the Beatles CDs first came out in 1987, they didn't appear on the album charts. There was a top catalog albums chart.
Yeah.
So that's why in your book, albums like Please Please Me with the Beatles, they're ranked very low because
they didn't count them
in the top 200 back then.
It's only been recently, like when they did the remixes, they started appearing on the albums. Now they're counting them. They weren't counting them back then. I agree. And that just doesn't make any sense either. But it's Billboard. What can I do?
And these albums,
it's weird. You pick up the book and you say, what the hell is Please Please Be doing at the bottom of the charts? And it's because, this is the American charts, and we had Meet the Beatles and the Beatles' second album instead, so Please Please Me didn't show up on the charts until just recently when they did the remixes, remasters, whatever. Yeah.
So that's another thing. Whenever these archival box sets come out of Beatles and solo, and they reappear on the charts, people are buying different variations of the archival box set, a single version, a double disc version, and the deluxe version. So how do you account really for, where they place on the charts if you've got all these different versions coming out at the same time? And then when it reappears later, when it's not because of the archival box set, you assume it's just the single disc version.
All I do is go by what Billboard has on their charts. I don't know what else to do. I mean, when they re-released, when Paul puts out the remix of Ram and it has an extra album in it, and it has all these extra songs, it's still Ram, so I counted it as Ram. The distinctions were like Let It Be Naked, which was listed separately on Billboard, and like the Yellow Submarine Songbook, which is completely different from the original Yellow Submarine. So I counted those things separately. When they were really different, they're counted separately. When they're don't even have the same name, I guess I should say, they were counted separately.
Okay. Well, here are some things that I think will surprise people. I don't want to give away the number ones in both categories for the singles and the albums, but
the album actually was probably easy to predict, I would guess.
I don't know.
Yeah, really? Okay. Anyway.
The Traveling Wilburys album, the first one, ranked higher than any George Harrison solo album, more than All Things Must Pass.
I know. It stayed in the top 10 for 2-3 months. It just stayed up there, and it just drop and then it go back up and it drop and go back up. It had longevity, that's for sure. But it also had like 5 superstars on it. I'm
Right.
sure that helped sell it. In
And
the same
yet,
way,
going,
I was going to
yeah.
say, in the same way, Say sold so many copies. I think it was more due to Michael Jackson than it was to Paul McCartney, honestly. And I think having all these extra people on Traveling Wilburys helped it as well. So it's not just a George album. Or
Well, the Traveling Wilburys were in the top 10 for 22 weeks, you wrote in your
22.
book.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
And I also disagree what you just said about Say,
okay.
because I think the reason why that song was as big as it was yes, Michael Jackson was the biggest name at the time, but
Mhm.
it was the chemistry between the two of them sounding so good together. I really think if Say was just Paul alone or just Michael Jackson alone, I don't think it would have done as well.
I will agree with that, but I guess my point being that Say came out, it was on Paul's album, and the album didn't sell very well, for a song that was like at number 1 for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, whatever it was. So that's why I was saying I think it had more to do with Michael Jackson than Paul, as far as why it was still have been a hit, no matter what. I agree with that, but I think you can point to Michael Jackson for its success more than you can point to Paul for its success. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, you had said that Off the Ground was a disappointment in sales compared to the previous album, and Flowers in the Dirt only got as high as number 21. But it was on
Yeah,
the charts longer than Off the Ground
yeah,
was.
it was on the charts longer. I agree. Yeah, so it's kind of weird. It all depends on how you classify success, I guess. Whether it's high, whether it's ranking high, or whether it's staying on the charts for a very long time.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've picked up in your book is that very often you'll say this single wasn't that successful. And I'm looking at where it peaked and like Dark Horse went to number 15. That's not bad. Number
No,
50.
it's not for George. It wasn't successful when his previous singles had all hit the top 10, or at least the top 5, I think. So that, in a sense,
Bangladesh didn't. Yeah.
For George, it was not a success. Let's put it that way. For anybody else, 15 is a great success. Obviously,
Uh-huh.
anybody else, if you have a song that makes the top 100, you're a success. So to make 15 is a success for anybody else. I would agree with that. Yes,
Yeah. Well, I think for anybody to hit the top 40, it's a success.
exactly.
But there are times when you were comparing with Dark Horse, Give Me Love, which went to number 1. That was the last single
Mm-hmm.
from George. So yeah, it should have done better. But then there's, a year and a half apart there.
Yeah,
And the big disappointment, and you even said it, that it's a disappointment, was Letting Go, because Letting Go was the follow-up single to Listen to What the Man Said,
I
number
know.
1, and it only went as high as number 39.
Right.
And it's a great song. I don't
Yes,
understand
absolutely.
why.
There are a lot of great songs that didn't do well, and it's very disappointing. I mean, this one is a wonderful Paul McCartney song that I think made number 95 or something really, really low.
Uh-huh.
It's just like you have to suddenly wonder why certain things are hits and why other ones aren't, but that's true. I think I used to say that when I was doing the countdown of the top 40 with Casey Kasem. Why the heck is this song doing so well when this great song is way down at the bottom? Same's going to be
Yeah.
true of some of the Beatles singles, after all.
Well, there's something that I bring up in my podcast shows, and I apologize to people who are viewing this if you've heard me say this too often, but as someone who's had a career in radio, a lot of fans don't understand why certain songs don't do as well as they should. And mainly it has to do with the fact that the record buying public, for the most part, are young people.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're dealing with the top 40 charts, um, as soon as an artist gets to be a certain age, the program directors of those stations feel that the audience for those artists are just getting older. They're not the people that they want to appeal to. So they phase those artists out. And it has nothing to do with the quality of the songs at
Absolutely.
all. It was kind of miraculous in a way, and I love the song, but when George Harrison had Got My Mind Set on You, for a guy who was almost 45 years old to have a number 1 hit is really rare,
It
you
is. It
know?
is.
And, but for the most part, you study any artist at all, the history of music, there's only a certain period of time when the top 40 stations will play you, and gradually they're faded out. They're
I
phased
agree.
out of that. And without airplay,
It's
they're
not going
not
to
going to chart well.
Exactly. And I sort of hinted at that at various points when I talked about how radio stations were considering Paul oldies by the late 80s, you know, and that was kind of ridiculous. He had some great music then that just was not getting played. And like, you know, this one is, you know, for an example that I just gave, although that I guess that wasn't the 80s. But you see my point, you know, it's basically I'm agreeing with you. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not just the United States. When Free as a Bird was released as a single in the UK, there were problems for it to get airplay
Yeah.
in their own country because they figured that, you know, they're an oldies act, the Beatles.
Right.
Doesn't
Yeah.
matter they're the biggest band that ever was. It doesn't matter whether it was a great song or not. They only care about the demographics that they're shooting for.
Yeah.
And
And
so
that's changed from the old days, because back in the 60s, the DJs had a lot more power than the stations. DJs could play pretty much whatever they wanted, and you pick a DJ you liked because they played what you liked, and they would play, you know, they played novelty songs and followed by a soul song, followed by a country song. As long as it was interesting, they'd play it. And you know, that was the case when almost anything could get on the charts, and it didn't matter whether the person was old or not. But as radio became more of a business, it became much more structured and unfortunately lost a lot of its creativity.
well, even in the 60s, there were very tight playlists for top 40 stations, especially WABC in New York.
Okay.
But you were interviewed by Al Sussman at the Fest for Beatle fans recently. We did a show about a year ago just talking about this, lamenting how you know the singles charts have changed and everything. And you go back to the 60s and the 70s, you'll have artists like Frank Sinatra doing really well with his singles.
Yeah.
In the middle of that first half of 1964, when everything was the Beatles, here's Hello Dolly.
Yeah.
As a #1 hit from
Yeah.
Louis Armstrong. And even in the 70s, you've got Perry Como with It's Impossible. And he was close to being 60 years old then. And that would never happen now unless it's an artist like you're talking about 4 or 5 seconds. If you team up with an artist that's really appealing to the younger generation, like Kanye West and Rihanna, or all the singles that Elton John has been successful with the people, the more modern artists of today.
He's not having that many successes on his own as he used to back in the 70s and 80s. I'll agree. But he's still doing well because he knows that he has to appeal to a younger crowd.
Yeah. So it all comes down to that. So anytime that you look at any of these chart statistics, singles or albums, and you see them not doing well, that doesn't mean the songs or the albums are not good. It just has to do with the industry and the way that it's built. And a lot of people don't realize that. Some people think that the best songs that an artist puts out are always the most successful.
Right.
You know?
No, you know, and that's true with the Beatles. If you polled people and asked them what their favorite Beatles songs are, you'd get like A Day in the Life, you get Here Comes the Sun, you get While My Guitar Gently Weeps. None of them were singles. You know, some of their best songs were not singles. But you know, not everyone always realizes that.
Right. Very, very true. I'm surprised at how well the Beatles love
I love that.
where it's positioned here of all time on the album charts. That did really well. 84 weeks on the charts. That's really impressive.
It was, you know, but you know, for those of us who are Beatle fans, it was something new and we all enjoyed it. I certainly loved listening to it. It's almost like, you know, trying to pick out where that lead came from. You know, it's like a mystery. You know, you get to hear it and go, oh, what is that from? I know what that's from, and trying to play with it. It's almost like a game. But they did such a wonderful job remixing it, and I was just so thrilled to have "I Am the Walrus" in stereo for the first time. You know, that was my you know, golden grail that I've always wanted.
Yeah, you've picked out a number of times when certain songs were available in stereo for the first time. You know, also introducing the Beatles. It went as high as, well, in your list here, number 20. I'll give that away.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of those, you know, that I still remember buying that when I was a kid, you know, because it was in the cutout pile, so it was cheap and I could afford it. You know, and they sold a lot of copies of those because they wanted to get them out there and make as much money as they could before they got sued into oblivion. So it did sell well.
Right. It's also interesting to see how well all the different compilations came out from the 70s on up. And really and truly, and I've said this many times, the Red and the Blue compilations are so important in Beatle history. I'm sorry, because for a lot of new generations, that's where it all started, learning the Beatles catalog from those two compilations. And the Beatles one became what the Red and the Blue were.
Correct. Yeah, Red and the Blue were the best-selling, compilations until one came out, and then one came out, and I like to point out in the book that people would the album One came out in 2000, and it was the top-selling album of the entire decade.
Right.
And when you get people saying, "Oh, the Beatles weren't that big," oh, come on, these are 40-year-old songs, and it's the #1 album of the decade. And I like to point out how the Beatles would used to brag, oh, people will still be listening to us in the year 2000. Everyone go, ah, sure they will, sure they will. Well, it was the #1 album of the entire 2000 decade. So yeah, that's the way it is. Sorry.
Yeah, not only that, but all the archival box sets,
Mhm.
although they don't stay on the charts that long, they
No.
all make the top 10, and some
Well,
of them make the top 3.
the thing is with the Beatles now, whenever they put out something, all of us Beatle fans run out and get it the first week. So it zooms up the chart. And then once we all have a copy, it zooms back down again nowadays.
Yeah.
So Egypt Station was Paul's first #1 album in like 30, 40 years, whatever it was. It zoomed up the charts. We all bought it. And then 4 weeks later, it was gone. So it's just the way the charts are done these days.
Yeah, but again, it all comes down to airplay as well.
Yeah.
I mean, when any veteran artist like Paul, Bob Dylan just went through the same thing with his last album, The Who with their last album, they stay on the charts for about 4 weeks.
Yeah.
All of their fans go out, gobble it up, and then that's it. But if those albums were treated like it was the 70s, and those albums were played on rock radio or top 40 radio, you could have a healthy debate as to whether or not you think that they would do really well. But no doubt about it, they'd have more longevity.
Absolutely. But the other problem is some of the fans, some of us fans who are older, get to the point where when Paul plays live, he doesn't play a lot of the new songs. He really doesn't. He plays all his old hits because that's what everyone wants. And if he tries to play something off of, some of the new albums, the audience, uses that to go to the bathroom. And it's I can see why he would go, well, what's the point? Elton John is the same way. He says, I'm going to play all my hits because that's what people want to hear. If I try to play the new stuff, they leave. So, you got to understand it from their point of view too. But if the radio stations played the new stuff, people would stay and listen to it. So it's a sort of a vicious circle there.
I know that, but I also look at it a different way, and that is that, an artist like Paul can't control what radio stations play, but he sure can control what he performs.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not saying that he should ram everything down everyone's throat, but there's no harm in playing 2-3 songs from the new album. And he actually was doing that for a while.
Yeah.
If you go back to Flowers in the Dirt, he played a lot of songs from that album. He played a lot of songs from Off the Ground, from Chaos and Creation. There's been less and less of it as he, makes new albums, but he still tries. He really didn't do it with McCartney 3. He only played Women and Wives, and that was only at a few shows. Yeah. So, I realize it's a tough decision to make, but if radio or whatever outlet it is that exposes your music to young people, if they're not playing it, then the only choice Paul has, if he wants that music to sell, if it matters to him, is for him to do it himself. Same thing with Ringo.
Yeah. No, yeah, you never hear Ringo do any of his new stuff when he goes live. I agree. Which is sad because some of his newer stuff is very good.
Yeah.
As I point out in the book, there's a lot of good Ringo stuff that people just don't know about, and if they just check it out, they'd probably like it.
Anyway. Which brings me to my next topic of conversation: albums that didn't make the charts at all.
Yeah.
Time Takes Time, which is one of Ringo's best albums, no doubt.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorites. There's not a bad song on that album, and it never made the chart, which is very depressing. It took him another 4 or 5 years before he tried again. That definitely should have made the chart. I'm trying to think of what else. The stuff that doesn't make the chart is usually it's mostly Ringo stuff. It's sad to say it. His last album didn't make the chart. Of course, it's not really an album; it's more of an EP.
Right.
So that didn't make the chart. I'm trying to think of what else. There were a lot of other minor, live albums and things that Ringo put out that didn't make the chart. Paul actually had a couple things that didn't make the chart too, more recently, but they were live albums. They weren't like, they weren't studio albums.
Mm.
And of course, his Fireman songs.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that
McGear,
up.
McGear should have made the chart. That's a great album,
Uh-huh.
So
But I can understand the first two Fireman albums not making the
yeah,
charts, but Electric Arguments,
yeah, he even performed some of those songs live,
yeah,
promoted, and it still didn't make the charts. Who knows? So there's only so much I can do. And the other thing I do in the back of the book, just to point out, is I do have a discography, so you can see what made the chart and what didn't,
right.
because the discography does show how high it got and everything.
Yeah, that's one of the many things I like about what you do in your book. Like we said earlier, if you want to go by where the songs peaked, you have it arranged that way.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the book is a combination of where it peaked and the longevity. And longevity is the biggest factor, really, I think, overall.
Yeah, definitely. The albums could stay low on the charts for a long time and do really well. Paul's Wings Over America stayed on the chart for a tremendously long time. I mean, it did hit #1, but it also stayed on the chart for like a year as he was touring, to promote it. And so that got much, much higher than you would think, just because of how many weeks it stayed on the chart.
Yeah, Flowers of the Dirt was on the chart for 50 weeks.
Yeah, that was
Plus,
another
he toured with it.
Exactly. It didn't really get very high, but it hovered near the bottom for a long time.
Right.
And now, of course, all the old albums keep popping back up on the charts. Abbey Road has hardly left the charts for the last couple of years. It's always been on there somewhere because people are still buying it. It's not, Billboard doesn't have an oldies chart anymore. They just list everything together, which is what they should have done all along, honestly. And Let It Be, when Get Back came out, the movie Get Back came out, obviously that jumped back on the charts again. So a lot of these things, actually, Let It Be was still on the charts when I did this book. So if you look at the book, Let It Be, probably if I did the book again today, would be higher on the chart because the movie had just come out right around the time the book was done.
Right. What were the biggest surprises for you when doing this research, if we haven't covered that already?
I think the biggest surprise is that the Beatles songs didn't do better. Like you said, Yesterday was at number 50, and I was like, oh my gosh, that depressed me. What I mean? I think that was one, and also just seeing how some of the newer stuff, 4 or 5 seconds getting so high up, really surprised me. I knew it was a hit, but I didn't think it was that big of a hit. But once more, it was the longevity that made a big difference with that one.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually surprised that Hey Jude wasn't #1, but I will say here, I'm going to give away a hint. It's #3. So there's 2 songs that actually did better than Hey Jude in this book, even though they didn't stay at #1 as long. So that was a little bit of a surprise to me. I kind of wanted to cheat and find a way to make it work, but I couldn't.
Yeah. Well, I love reading all this stuff. I'm still a big fanatic when it comes to the charts, even though I don't agree with the system totally and all the changes that are made.
And please, everyone, if you read this book, don't blame me. I didn't write the data. I'm just putting it together because I agree with you. Some of these things just don't make any sense.
It's kind of like if you're into stats when it comes to sports, and rules change over the years, and that can affect the overall statistics and the history of that sport.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good comparison. Yeah.
So yeah, and but I always like to cite the charts all the time, especially when there's a single or an album that did really well. I love the fact that we always hear about when the Beatles occupied the top 5 singles in America, but not everybody is aware of the fact that Red Rose Speedway hit #1 for 3 weeks. It actually took out the Beatles 1967 to 1970 out of #1.
Mm-hmm.
And then George Harrison's Living in the Material World knocked out Red Rose Speedway.
Oh, that was a wonderful time to review it, man. I loved it. I was 14 years old at the time or something, and going to the store and seeing a new Beatle album every couple of weeks was just wonderful. and following it on the chart was amazing. But yeah, you're right. They were replacing each other. Or in 1970, when McCarthy and Let It Be and Abbey Road, Abbey Road was still on the charts, and John had, Instant Karma was fighting against,
Let It Be. Yeah.
Right, they're all right at the same time, and just seeing how much they. One of the fun things to me is looking at the charts in the back and seeing how close everything was to each other. You know.
You would have thought that they would have been careful with each other and not release at the same time. You know,
Well, the
I,
story is that Paul argued with them over that. You know, if you
oh,
remember, they tried to get him to hold back McCartney, so that they could do Let It Be, and he refused to do that. And so they were competing with each other. Absolutely.
yeah. But I'm also talking about the years that followed
Oh,
when you would have, especially towards the end of the year, 1973, you had Mind Games, Ringo, and Band on the Run all coming out within a few months of each other.
yeah.
So they weren't all that concerned about the competition against each other back
Yeah.
then. So
Well,
in
it's fun.
19,
It's fun also to see, poor John, because he just couldn't understand why he wasn't hitting number one when Paul and Ringo were, and especially Ringo. And at one point, I point out in the book, he sent Ringo a telegram when Ringo had
yeah,
a big hit with "Oh My," I think it was, and saying, "Congratulations, please write me a hit song."
yeah, and that's another thing. As I continue to say, the charts are a reflection of popularity. As for the quality of the song or the album, that's
Mhm.
all subjective. And sometimes a song didn't make number one because of its competition, that there might have been a better song. Same thing with the albums.
Yeah.
Um, Paul had that string of number one albums from Red Rose Speedway through Wings Over America, and
Mhm.
London Town didn't make number one because there's this album called Saturday Night
That's a great
Fever,
line. Yes, exactly.
you know,
You
which
know,
dominated the charts at the time, and that's
that's the way it was.
understandable.
If you had released it 6 months later, it would have been number one. Exactly. So sometimes it's just timing, and sometimes things are just strange. Talking about surprises, I'd say one of the other surprises, although it wasn't really a surprise when I was doing the book, was seeing how some of the most famous songs we know never made it big. Like Imagine, never made number one. And when you think of John, that's the song you think of quite often. And even though the album hit number one, the single never did, which is kind of strange. You'd expect that.
You got to see what number two and number one was to understand that.
Yeah,
You know,
sometimes I'd point that out in the book. I admit I didn't do it for every single one. Why something didn't hit number one because of X, Y, and Z. It was in its way. Yeah.
yeah, you did mention, and I'm grateful you put it in there. The Ringo album went to number two. The reason why it didn't make number one is because of an album called Goodbye Yellow Brick Road.
Hmm.
Hard to top that one at the time.
Yeah,
You
yeah, that's
know.
that's a masterpiece, you gotta admit.
All right. So, do you have any plans at all to update this book as the years go on?
Possibly, but not anytime too soon since it just came out, obviously. The problem with updating it is there's only like one or two albums a year, maybe, that come out, and singles just aren't making the charts anymore. Paul and Ringo, there's going to be re-releases, of course, and some of the old albums. Every once in a while, the White Album shows up on the charts again. Abbey Road, Let It Be, some of the Revolver just got re-released, of course, and that got the charts. If they're going to remix Rubber Soul next, which I'm hoping is going to come next, I'm sure that'll pop up on the charts. But other than that, there's not a lot of activity like there used to be. If you look at the charts, you'll see, that's going on. So if I'm going to update it, it's probably not going to be for quite a few years.
Yeah, sad but true. But it is a great feeling when like Beatle albums reappear, several of them
Yeah,
all at once. The Beatles one will always keep reappearing no matter
that's
what.
true.
So
Yeah,
that's
especially
probably
around
good.
Christmas time. Yep,
It's gonna creep up a little bit higher and higher in the list here.
absolutely. Yeah,
Now you've actually written a couple of books on the Monkees. You want to tell us about that?
sure. With Mark Arnold, I wrote two different books on the Monkees. The first one is Looking for the Good Times, and this one basically we go through every single song they ever recorded, talk about it, and put it in order of when they recorded it. Because with the Monkees, some of that stuff never got recorded, never got released for years and years later. So it's
Hmm.
an interesting way to read it in order and see how the style of music changed over the years. It also talks about who wrote the songs and if the Monkees played instruments on it, which instruments they played, that kind of stuff. So it goes in a lot of detail if you're a Monkees fan. The sequel is Headquartered, in which we talk about what they did after the show ended. So we go year by year, in 1990, here's what they did. In 2000, talk about their successes, their failures, Mike creating MTV, basically Mickey becoming a director in England, Peter going to jail, Davey becoming a jockey, all kind of stuff like that. I should also mention, if you're going to give me a second to mention this,
Hmm.
I edited an anthology called Across the Universe for all the Beatle fans, if you're interested in that. I got a bunch of really big name science fiction fans who are all Beatles fans to write fictional stories. The idea was, what if? What if the Beatles, not just had they never met, had they split up, had they reunited, but what if the Beatles were wizards? What if they were Ghostbusters? What if they were superheroes? What if they were zombies? It's a lot of fun. And if you're a Beatle fan, you'll be able to catch all the inside jokes that the average person won't get from some of the major science fiction writers out there today.
Wow.
So that was
Showing
fun.
a
That
lot
was
of
really fun.
imagination.
Yes,
A lot
it
of
was
imagine. Yeah.
absolutely.
Interesting. You know, when it comes to the Monkees, I'm very much a song man. I think that everything matter. The song is more important than anything else.
I've never been a big fan of the Monkees TV show, ironically. So when I talk to Monkees fans and they start talking about TV shows, I don't know. I was only interested in the music, really.
You and I are too much alike here. But I've grown to love the Monkees music more and more. And the thing is, and I'm not taking anything away from the talent that the Monkees had, but when you've got Jerry Goffin and Carole King writing
They got the
songs, and
greatest songwriters of all time
Neil
working with them. Of
Diamond,
course, they're going to have some great songs.
Neil
And
Sedaka, David Gates, you
I
know,
know.
early on, you know, Paul Williams.
Yep.
So, you know, when you've got material like that,
It's
and
going to
you,
be good.
but you also, let's face it, I think Mickey Dolenz is one of the greatest rock singers who doesn't get enough credit. And
I just saw him in concert 3 days ago. It was
yeah,
wonderful, wonderful. He still has a voice. It's amazing.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen him many times too. I've
Um,
seen the Monkees the most with three of them
yeah.
without Mike.
Yeah.
And I've seen them many times solo. And I've
Can
always
I add,
enjoyed them.
one of the wonderful things was when Adam Schlesinger got them together and made the album Good Times.
Yeah.
Because what he did for that album is he did what they had done in the 60s, which he's got some of the best songwriters out there today to write songs for them. So that album has, like, you know, it has Adam Schlesinger, obviously. It also has Andy Partridge. It has Rivers Cuomo. It has so many big name writers of today's great pop music that it's a wonderful album, because that's why they were successful in the old days, of course, you know, because they had such great writers, including Mike Nesmith, of course. He wrote some good songs.
Mike was way ahead of his time.
Absolutely. And Mickey wrote a few good songs too.
So, and you know, Davy Jones is quite a good singer, you know, with his background too. You had two really strong singers for pop between Davy and Mickey, and that carried them with their hits. So, but you had the material there, and if you've got the material, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
So
no, they also had some really, really terrible songs too, which we talk about in the book, and some of the Monkees fans hate us for that because we say that this song sucks. But that happens anyway.
All right. Well, this has been great talking to you. Again, the book is called The Beatles on the Charts, Michael Ventrella. Anything you want to know about where the songs peaked, Beatles and solo, where the albums peaked, how many weeks it's been on the charts. And if you want to take a look towards the end, show you right here. This is an example, week by week, what was on the charts in each year. And you'll find that there'll be several Beatle albums or solo albums on the charts the same weeks. It's a great thing to look at and to see how, you know,
kind of imagine what it was be like back then to, you know, to know all this stuff happening, you know. It's or alternatively reminiscing like I did when I look back at like 74 and 73 going, oh, I remember that. I rushed down to the record store. So that's always fun.
Yeah, it's also fun to look back at 1964 especially, and the singles charts and the album charts. But, you know, there was more than the top 5 singles. You know, the Beatles really dominated the Hot 100 then, and they may have had some songs underneath the top 40, but it's still impressive to have so much all out at the same time and on different labels. And, you know, it's fun to observe all that and to have it all in one book.
Thank you.
So thank you, Michael, for putting together this book, and best of luck, continued success with it. And thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time.